All right, why don't we get started? Welcome to the first panel on thinking about think tanks. I have to thank Michelle Flournoy for getting us off to a great start. Indeed, my only concern is that her tour de force was so good and so comprehensive that we all have nothing left to say. I will therefore warn my panelists not to, as I put it, poach it forward and steal the topics from the later panels, because they have things to say as well. But we're going to start off by talking about, in some ways, a little bit in terms of history, in terms of the evolution of think tanks, where they used to be as opposed to where they are now. And in some ways, this touches on the question that I think Heather Hurlburt asked Michelle Flournoy downstairs about whether or not things have changed from the mid-90s to now and whether that is a totally bad thing. Let me start by introducing the panelists in the order in which they will speak. We'll start with James McGann. He is a senior lecturer of International Studies at the Lauder Institute and the director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to that, he was a professor of international relations at Penn as well. He served as a senior fellow and director of the Think Tanks and Foreign Policy program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia since 1989. For the last 25 years, he served as president of McGann Associates, which is a program and management consulting firm specializing in the challenges facing think tanks and philanthropic institutions. Dr. McGann is the founder and editor of the Global Go-To Think Tank Index, which means that a lot of our representatives, other panelists, are going to be very, very nice to him throughout the entire rest of the conference.
I don't think so.
To my immediate right is it Xenia or Xenia?
Xenia.
Xenia, okay, good. Xenia Wickett is the project director of the U.S. program and dean of the Academy for Leadership in International Affairs at Chatham House, which is based in the United Kingdom. Prior to this, she was the executive director of the Peace Nexus Foundation, based just outside of Geneva. From 2005 to 2009, Xenia was at Harvard's Belfer Center, where she was the director of the Project on India and the Subcontinent, and executive director for research, as well as being a member of Belfer's board. She's also served in numerous government positions, most recently as the director for South Asia at the National Security Council. Third to my immediate left is, Ted Piccone, or Piccone? Piccone. Oh, Piccone, okay. Piccone, who is a senior fellow with the Project on International Order and Strategy and Latin America Initiative in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in foreign policy dimensions of human rights and democracy, multilateral diplomacy, and U.S.-Latin American relations. He has previously served as the acting vice president and director of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Prior to being there, he was executive director and co-founder of the Democracy Coalition Project, and served 8 years as a senior foreign policy advisor on Latin America and global democracy and human rights in the Clinton administration. And last but most certainly not least, to my far left, Rachel Bronson is the senior fellow for global energy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, where she directs the council's activities on changing the U.S. energy landscape and its implications for U.S. foreign policy. Prior to this, she served for 7 years as the Chicago Council's vice president for studies. In that capacity, she regularly raised a healthy amount of money to support the council's policy research. Prior to her coming to the Chicago Council, Bronson also served as senior fellow and director of Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, as well as CSIS, Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and Columbia University. And with those introductions out of the way, Jim, the floor is yours.
Outside of the U.S., the notion of a nonprofit, certainly non-governmental is prevalent, but the nonprofit notion and a number of the characteristics of American think tanks are quite unique. We didn't invent it, as many people suggest, but there are compelling reasons, and what I think is important to understand and try to probe is, why are there so many think tanks in the United States? What is it about the United States that encourages a large number of think tanks relative to every other country in the world? We have the largest number of think tanks relative to any other country in the world, and they are, which is the distinguishing dimension, nonprofit and independent. The second part that I would like to focus is on the sort of traditional notion of think tanks, and then what I think are the distinguishing characteristics of think tanks. And I'm just going to go through the various dimensions that I see. And then what I see as the unfulfilled, ironic, unfulfilled promise of think tanks and why that might be. So in terms of the traditional activities or functions of think tanks, they conduct research on policy problems and present solutions in a similar fashion to, but with a policy orientation in terms of university-based scholars. Secondly, they often advise on both short-term, as Michelle alluded to, and I would say increasingly, and part of the restructuring that I think has to take place at think tanks is a much more immediate, quicker response time because understanding the issues and being able to respond to them. But traditionally it's been both the short term and the long term, the big long term strategic think, and then the sort of immediate policy concerns and responding to them. Evaluating, and it depends on the nature of a think tank, and there are two major categories in the United States from my perspective of both inside think tanks and outside think tanks, those that are invited in to government, so RAND, Urban Institute, RFF, and a number of others that are invited into government to help them formulate both technocratic and general policy analysis along major policy issues. To interpret an important function of policies and current events for the electronic and print media, the sort of talking heads phenomenon. So, every Sunday morning show, and thanks to the 24/7 cable news network, think tankers are the likely, people to turn to if you want background or if you want someone, and increasingly in a partisan environment, two counterpoints on any particular issue. 5, facilitate issue networks and exchange and idea exchange. And I would suggest that, and Blair is a key example of this, think tanks is a place to float trial balloons in terms of key policies to see what the reaction is to them. And then what Michelle had mentioned in terms of supply of personnel for government and for think tanks, for out-of-office politicians, policymakers, where they can recharge their batteries, or what I describe as the revolving door. So that's the sort of broad types of activities that think tanks have traditionally performed. The revolving door is fairly unique to the United States and institutionalized in a way that does not exist elsewhere. However, in the travels internationally, it is something with both interest and sometimes fear that think tanks and governments are looking at abroad. I think it's important to sort of, in a comparative policy and politics sense, to explain why there are 1,800 think tanks, and sort of carves out what is the sort of unique dimensions of the U.S. political system and why think tanks fill that void. I mean, it is not a current Republican mantra that the government that governs best governs least. It is deeply embedded in our political system and culture that having independent institutions that consciously can constrain government as an essential part of the American democracy. So de Tocqueville, when he visited, commented on interest groups or factions, and think tanks are certainly a part of that. And that, in my mind, explains in part why there are 1,800 think tanks in the United States. But first and foremost, our system is porous and highly decentralized system of government at separation of powers, federal, state, and local. And for that reason, there are many points where policy advice can be sought and is needed. We have a weak civil service and a strong reliance on independent debate. And when I travel abroad, and I have to do it cautiously when the State Department is sponsoring my visit, I sort of say in America, and while they're wonderful and dedicated and very bright employees in the civil service, the perception of the American public in terms of the civil service is one rung above a used car salesperson. And part of that is deeply embedded in our political culture and affects why we go to independent think tanks. Second, we do not have a strong two-party system, and we have weak party discipline, which makes it possible for any entrepreneurial member of Congress to zip up the line. There's not strict seniority rules that are present in other countries, and therefore those individuals are seeking and have sought think tanks to help. The U.S. president candidacy often, while connected to a party, is not totally tied to the ideology, strict ideology or platform of the party. We have a hyper-pluralistic and highly individualistic society, so the independence and the diversity, in some respects, the discussion around transparency and influence. The problem in America, in many respects, is that there are too many voices, and it's cacophonous and conflicting, and that, in some respects, in my mind, helps feed the need for a lot of think tanks, but also creates a degree of dysfunctionality. And finally, we have a highly developed philanthropic culture that does not exist elsewhere, which helps the funding of independent institutions. And the recent phenomenon that's directly related to things that we've talked about, which has not been mentioned, is the professionalization of philanthropy, from donors just giving money to institutions to developing staff who have specific careers and programmatic interests, which then become reflected in an idiosyncratic way in some respects in terms of their funding, which influences, and what I would suggest that most philanthropists, which will end any possible potential of getting money from foundations, is that they are merely interlopers in the process. They are neither the users or producers of policy advice, but are a major determinant in it. In terms of, and finally, and I'll conclude on what I see as the unfulfilled promise of think tanks, and in some respects, it's the unique space that has not been seized, and there are reasons for it, which I think we might want to explore. And the unfulfilled promise from my standpoint, and the question from the graduate student that's the perfect example from Fletcher as to why we have students in the room, is her question was right on. The question is, why are think tanks risk adverse? And in my mind, one of the key roles that think tanks can play, because they're not government policymakers, and there are whole reasons why I would suggest that governments are not very good at thinking critically and effectively about policy challenges. But one of the things that think tanks can and should do is take risks in terms of challenging, in terms of developing innovative policy proposals, and doing that and it's not to say that it's not done, but it's not done to the extent that it could, and and the major reason for that is that think tanks mirror in some respects. So in Michelle's last comment, I would suggest that it's incumbent upon this group and think tanks to not mirror the dysfunctionality of Congress, and to figure out a way to be ahead of that, and therefore be proactive and be innovative in terms of how to solve the problem, not abdicate to it. The other important part, which I think is critical in the world in which we live today, is the utter failure of think tanks to be multidisciplinary. And so the specialization that Michelle mentioned is, I think, in the world that we live in, and the unique role that think tanks can play, precisely because they're not academic institutions and are not driven by what I describe as the tyranny of academic disciplines, which really precludes the possibility of essentially thinking innovatively, interdisciplinary, about the many problems that we face. And that, I think, is a huge problem, and a space where think tanks, if properly funded, could do that. Now, places like RAND, I think it's one of the institutions from its inception, has had matrix teams and multidisciplinarity in its structure. Not every institution does, and they largely reflect the sort of functional or geographic orientation of universities and academic disciplines. I think that is something that needs to be shattered, and that think tanks can play a key role in carving out a new space for themselves. And then the final thing, which is what was really behind the student's question, is have think tanks challenge conventional wisdom, one of their key things. And I think, Michelle didn't mention what was the classic one, challenging, Bush's policy in terms of the Iraq War. And, that the only people that actually did was challenge it was the Office of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, which suggests that they were the only people that really came out. And the question is, why weren't think tanks, not that they might have questioned a little more what was going on, and that was an utter failure in terms of, think tanks and the role they play.
Thank you very much. Xenia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, and Dan, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm going to cover some of the ground that Michelle and Jim have covered, but hopefully kind of from a slightly different perspective, and add a couple of new points to it. There were a whole set of questions we were asked on the evolution of think tanks, and given that I come from a British think tank, I perhaps have a slightly different perspective, not so different because I spent most of my career over here, but there are some differences between the British system or the European system, where I spent a lot of time in South Asia, the Asian system, and that here, some of which Jim laid out. But let me start with the obvious. Essentially, why think tanks? Why bother? I mean, I'm always fascinated. In this country, working for a think tank, I don't think you would ever have to answer the question with a potential funder or supporter of why they should support you. They get it here. They get the value added of think tanks. I get that question all the time in the UK. Of, I'm work for BP. Wait a sec, we've got a strategic arm who can answer these questions, or Merrill Lynch, or why would we fund you outside? And so I've kind of gotten to a point where I'm pretty good at answering that question now. And what's more, I actually think it's a pretty legitimate reason. It's not just me being biased from my own perspective. And many of these, I'm going to run through them very quickly because they've been mentioned before. I actually think the most important thing that think tanks do is this long-term vision. I've worked in the NSC. You just don't have time to think over the long term because you are dealing with the short term. And we brought out a report just a couple of months ago on NATO, just before the NATO summit. And the critique that we had from our peer reviewers was that it didn't actually have enough reference to the summit and what needed to be done in the summit. That was intentional, because the summit is a waypoint. That was a month, 6 weeks ahead. What we cared about is where should NATO be going over the long term? What kind of skills, what kind of capabilities did it have? What kind of vision, what kind of path should it be taking? I didn't need to define what was going to take place in the summit. People in governments, people in the British government, the American government, in NATO itself were defining what should happen in the summit. That wasn't my job. That wasn't my value added. So I actually do think, I think that it is the responsibility of think tanks to very intentionally keep a long-term vision, which isn't to say ignoring the short term. It's using the short-term activities, the short-term events, as almost action-forcing events to get us to where we need to be over the long term. And that's a vision that I think is unique to think tanks, and that governments, with exceptions, they're supposed to do, but they find it extraordinarily hard to do. The second is, and I don't think this has been mentioned before, we can talk to people that governments can't. We can talk to people in opposition parties that governments can't. There are things that we can do that are quite sensitive that governments just get into too much trouble for doing. Or when they have those conversations, they have very different conversations, which is the third point, that I started, I worked in government and I would have conversations with my Indian colleagues. They would give me answers to questions that were really quite different from then when I went to Harvard. 6 months later, I was getting very different answers to the same questions because I was no longer representative of the US government. They weren't telling me what I wanted to hear or what they thought I wanted to hear because I was one step removed. Ironically, I now get very different answers to those same questions working in the UK because, again, America is this entity and that people think America, rightly so, is so all-powerful. They will often say what they think people want to hear. And so you do have to be very cognizant of what your label is. Who do you represent? And therefore, what is the response that I'm getting because of that? So that is another thing that we can do that is different. The fourth thing that I think tanks can do, and this has been mentioned, so I won't talk much about it, but we're unconstrained by current policy choices. Whether that's ideological policy choices, whether that's political policy choices, we're not constrained by the same restrictions. We can go places that, if you're working in a government, you can't go because you can't have a conversation about, well, what would happen if we just turned away from Israel and just were all out supportive of the Palestinians? I'm not saying we should be, but that's a question that you really can't ask in government. And have a good conversation about. And I think that is important. And then that not only, it's fixed with this idea of think tanks therefore can be more independent, but also can be seen to be more independent. And this is something that Michelle brought up, perception versus reality. Perception is extraordinarily important. And I will come back to that. There are a lot of think tanks that call themselves nonpartisan or apolitical that actually are nonpartisan or apolitical, but are not perceived to be nonpartisan or apolitical. It also means, and this is a point that we were talking about earlier, think tanks can innovate in a way that governments can't do. They can test out trial balloons, new ideas, as Jim said. The fifth thing that I think tanks are unique in being able to do, at least as opposed to government, is, and again, I won't spend time on this. Michelle talked about it, is they can inform and influence the public debate. And this is particularly important as long as governments are being driven in large part by politics and by their voters. Increasingly, I could make an argument, and again, I'm now sitting in the UK. We have an election next year in the UK. Increasingly, governments look out, or politicians look out to see, well, where's the public on this issue? And therefore, how much space do I have to maneuver within the issue? And I think that think tanks actually can open the space for a broader debate about an issue, and therefore give their governments, give their politicians more space in which to craft their policy. We mentioned this briefly, and I think it's a very, very important part. The sixth thing that I think tanks do, which they can bridge stovepipes. Government is, you have DOD that focuses on security in a traditional sense, and you have state that focuses on diplomacy, and then within the State Department, you have the regional bureaus and you have the functional bureaus, and everybody is stovepiped. Everybody has their own particular area of expertise, and yes, you craft papers that have to be cleared across the building that brings you down to the lowest common denominator, but it's very hard to share ideas across bureaus, across departments. It's very hard to take lessons learned from one region and apply them to another region. Think tanks can at their best do that. They're smaller, they can incentivize in ways that actually does bridge different parts of the institution. I would also say they're often not terribly good at doing that. I do think that think tanks, my own included, our tendency is to think in our own narrow space. So it does require creating incentive structures that demands that you bridge. So I think they can do it. I think they're not necessarily terribly good at doing it. And that kind of brings to the foreign and domestic policy division. I personally believe that think tanks that bridge the foreign and the domestic have an increased level of value added, if you will, than ones that are uniquely foreign or uniquely domestic. And I say this coming from a foreign policy think tank. In today's world, we did a study earlier this year about elite perceptions of the US in Asia and in Europe. And one of the things that we found that was very striking in Europe is that Europeans look at America's domestic policy. And they consider Americans to be hypocritical because their domestic policy, their foreign policy is one of democratic equality, everybody having a vote, equal rights, and yet domestically we put up with vast amounts of poverty, we put up with vast amounts of inequality, we have the death penalty, our gun rights system is, from a European perspective, completely crazy. Our conversation on, how can we even be talking about universal healthcare, whereas most European countries have it by default. So domestic is foreign, foreign is domestic in today's world. The split that we have is old-fashioned and dysfunctional at this point. And then just in passing, the seventh thing that I think think tanks can do is train the next generation. And Michelle talked about this a lot, and I think it's extraordinarily important. Again, I'm a little bit biased. As Dan said, I'm Dean of the Academy at Chatham House, which is all about trying to train the next generation. So I'm a groupie on this particular issue. But I think it's incredibly important. Think tanks are about ideas. If you can actually train the next generation to have independent thought, to be open, to be engaged with different voices, with different opinions, the resonance that has is so much greater than a report that you put out. So I actually think that this is where the future is. I think it's extraordinarily hard to do. But I think it's something that is very important for think tanks to do. Let me just in passing say two things about the US that distinguishes them, I think, from others. The first, and this has already been mentioned, I don't know any other think tank community, whether it's the two areas I look at most in Europe or in Asia, that rotates people in and out of government in the same way that they do here. The systems just don't work that way, which is to our loss. I think it's extraordinarily valuable that people can be in government working very, very hard for 4 years. They can get out for 2 or 3 years. They can refresh their ideas, get different perspectives, and then they can go back in. And then the second one is the thing that worries me here, and I think is different in the UK and in parts of Europe, it's not different in Asia, is think tanks here in the US are far more partisan than they are in the UK, than they are in France, not so in Germany, not so in parts of Asia. And I think that's a great shame. It's why I think that actually think tanks do have a role to play in today's political dysfunction to actually bridge. Some of them do that better than others. I would say one more thing that is more relevant, I think, for non-American think tanks, which is government agencies are sometimes too small elsewhere in the world. So in the UK, I will often have people from the FCO, the Foreign Office, say to me, I'm so glad you're doing this. We don't have the capacity to think through these questions. We love the fact that you're thinking through these questions. You're putting in an awful lot of work, and then you're feeding them into our system. That's less relevant for the US, which has a, relatively speaking, large government. Let me finish with one thing, which is I think that the think tank community, the think tank world, the world of ideas is changing very, very fast. It's changing because technology is changing, in part. So we have to move that much faster. We have to have answers that much faster. I'm not sure that think tanks have really grasped that as much as they need to. I don't know what the answer is, because there is a huge tension between allowing think tank staff to blog and be very, very responsive, but then everything we do is based on our reputation, and if you're moving fast and you're blogging fast, then that has potential risks for your reputation. And so there's an inherent tension. We haven't answered it yet. But certainly new technologies are changing the space. They're also changing the number of people who have a voice, from the individuals through to other institutions in the corporate sector. And so it's a much more competitive world out there. I actually think this is a very good thing for the world of ideas. I don't see any reason why Chatham House or CSIS or Heritage is necessarily going to have a better idea than a law company is going to have. And I think to the extent that we can, again, bridging, working together, it would be extraordinarily valuable. The other thing that I think is happening, and I think is a bad thing, is I think that more and more think tanks are narrowing. And I certainly see this in the UK. You see more and more think tanks that are focused on one issue, one idea, whether it's non-proliferation, whether it's the Middle East. And again, I think that actually we need to be broadening, we need to be building bridges, we need to be recognizing that there's value added in all sorts of different ways in different industries. And I think this narrowing is a unfortunate characteristic that's happening at the moment. Maybe I will finish there.
Thank you very much. That was great. Ted, floor is yours.
Well, there's definitely a cumulative effect here of points that are going to be echoed, and I'll try to avoid some of that. But I like one of your last points, Inya. We're all think tanks now. I mean, we're all kind of walking individual think tanks. And because of the democratization of technology, we can constantly have a voice in the policy debate. The question is, are we being heard, and does anyone have time to read it? Let me avoid some of the, skip over some of the initial comments I was going to make about what think tanks do, and Michelle's opening really covered all the groundwork, plus what we've heard this morning. And I'll give you a little bit of a Brookings perspective while thinking more generally about the think tank world. Brookings turns 100 in 2016, and its initial genesis was to provide policymakers some kind of additional knowledge and expertise that they didn't have, that they needed at the time. Government was growing and becoming more complex, and they needed to reach outside into other parts of society. It was called the Institute for Governmental Effectiveness, was the original name for Brookings.
That's a horrible name. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is. It is hard to tweet that. That's why we came up with, Robert Brookings made all this happen, so now it's just called Brookings. But it makes a general point, which is problems are complex and time is short, and the policy marketplace needs translators and bridge builders who can operate in both the knowledge generation world as well as the knowledge consumption world, and we get better outcomes in theory. Universities provide some of these public goods, but over time that profession has changed as well, and there's greater specialization at universities and demand for other fields that tend to generate more revenue, whether it's business or science or law. Of course, as some people have mentioned, the private sector also does some of this work, and consultants, in my experience at the Pentagon, were always there knocking on your door wanting to tap into some of your research dollars to provide you advice and information that, frankly, you already knew. It's kind of confirming what you're already giving them. I did not find it particularly useful. And for-profit companies do have other missions. They're maximizing profit, and so they don't always have the public interest first and foremost. You also have, and we haven't heard that much about it, a little bit, in-house think tanks in government agencies that do play an important role, and particularly in the foreign policy and national security field, where so much information is classified. This is a very important role that is playing an important generator of information and analysis, and providing kind of real-time intelligence coming through secure channels from the field. And think tanks shouldn't even try to compete with that. Well, I shouldn't say shouldn't try, but you have to recognize that there is a special value added that they have, particularly in the U.S. system, that is important and valuable. In my experience in policy planning at the State Department, the short description was in-house think tank. But in reality, my experience was that you're really trying to align the secretary's priorities with the rest of the bureaucracies and try to get some of those new ideas implemented. And you're not sitting there thinking up new ideas. That is already should have already happened before you got there, and it's about trying to turn those into concrete actions. And yes, looking over the horizon from the inbox, the secretary has a meeting the next day with the foreign minister and the talking points have to be done, and you're weighing in on that, but you're trying to also think more strategically about longer term issues. But because you're operating in such a short-term oriented environment, it tends towards more operational kinds of activities. And then you have the think tanks, and I think they live in that space in between these different worlds where these complex problems can be analyzed more dispassionately with a longer historical and future-oriented timeline. And you're working with people who have had experience both in deeper kind of research and in delivering concise, timely, policy-relevant recommendations, or at least that's what they try to do. So I think that is a special role for think tanks. We've also talked a little bit about the public education role that they play. Brookings, we're .edu. I think that, I don't know how many others are .edu, but we take that mission very seriously. Everything that we do is for the public. It's public information that's published on our website or in some other format. there is no such thing as private research, contracted research for hire at Brookings. It doesn't exist, and that's really important. So many of our events are public. We're doing more and more on the web and webcasting, et cetera. Let me switch to this question about domestic and foreign think tanks and synergy. And what you're seeing is an increasing blurring of lines. Programs focused on U.S. issues inevitably get drawn into international issues and vice versa. It's globalization, it's interdependence, it's the world we live in. And at Brookings, we have 5 research programs that cover both domestic and foreign policy. So the problem then becomes stovepiping, and how do you make sure there's some kind of synergy and interdisciplinary work going on. And what we've done is we've tried to incentivize breaking down those stovepipes so that there are incentive funds that scholars can apply to if you're working cross-program or even within foreign policy program, if you're working with the overseas centers that we have to make sure that we're providing a better 360 kind of view of an issue. And I can give you some examples about that if you're interested. Another core value that think tanks bring to the table that I want to touch on briefly, and we can think later in the day get back to it, is the independence question. And there are various levels of independence. One is the independence of scholars from the institution that they work in. Scholars represent themselves, and there is no institutional Brookings position on anything. The example Michelle gave of signing on to a letter on a particular policy question, we actually don't do that at Brookings. The scholars can do that individually in their individual capacity, but they have to explicitly say that they are not representing the institution in doing so. So there's that level of independence that's very important. There's also no ideological line to toe. There's no interference by management in the content other than in the spirit of academic style peer review. Then there's the question of more functional independence, particularly independence from donors. And that's where, as Michelle pointed out, you get into some trickier questions that I think all think tanks are grappling with as the whole financial field of support for think tanks is changing. And there you really do need some very serious policies and firewalls and conflict of interest rules and much greater transparency to ensure there's no undue influence on the scholar's work. Finally, you wanted us to touch on impact, which Michelle did as well with some examples, but I wanted to say a little bit about how do you measure impact in the foreign policy field, which is incredibly difficult, and not just foreign policy, but policy more generally. We've looked at this for some years now, and as Andrew knows, we see kind of 3 main areas of impact. One is agenda setting, where you're bringing an issue into the public policy debate that maybe isn't getting the attention it needs. You're secondly shaping that debate. If that debate is already underway, you're putting some parameters on it, some specific ideas. And then thirdly is designing policy options, where this is much more detailed, fine-grained sense of what the various options and pros and cons are. We're even beginning to think of a 4th area, which is, let's say a policy is adopted, how is it being implemented, and how do you evaluate implementation of the idea and whether it worked or not? So everything that we do has to have some kind of policy relevance and a targeted policy audience. So when we look at proposals in-house, the question has to be answered, well, who is your audience here, and why? How are you going to reach that audience? And the audience depends and varies on what impact you're trying to have. So if you're really aiming for agenda setting, it might be a more media-focused, thought leaders, including trying to influence other think tanks, where some of the other options of designing policy, you're focused much more on the government officials themselves, whether that's in the Hill or in the administration. You also have to think about, in the foreign policy realm, how are you influencing foreign government officials? I mean, that is an important part of the equation here. And we have 3 foreign offices, one in China, one in India, and one in Qatar. And I think you need to be sensitive to their own different cultural contexts and ways of doing that. And it's obviously complex. You need to have good partners on the ground, not just where your offices are, but everywhere you want to have some kind of influence. And you need to resource that, and that is challenging. But it also explains why we are constantly meeting with senior officials from foreign governments. It's an important way for us to learn about what's happening in the rest of the world and how they're thinking about it, and also for us to share our ideas with them. We also have, of course, foreign ambassadors in Washington that tend to be quite important back in their capitals and often become foreign ministers themselves or very senior presidential advisors. This is something unique about the Washington ecosystem, that you're getting people who come through all the time who are in very senior levels of decision making, and so you need to constantly be communicating with them. Another point about impact is distinguishing between outputs and outcomes. It is easier to measure outputs. You've done so many op-eds, so many congressional testimonies, so many meetings with government officials and books. And you have to at least do those things. You can't have impact without them. But the outcomes is much more difficult to measure. It's really, I would say, impossible, because you're dealing with political leaders and officials who are not readily giving think tanks credit for this or that idea. They're taking credit for it themselves. And so you have to be realistic about that phenomenon. What I'm seeing is that donors increasingly want to see, well, how did you directly influence the president in making that decision? And you cannot answer that question, honestly. So I think donors also need to adjust their own expectations on how this works. And as you can imagine, if you're talking about trying to influence foreign government officials, there's a whole nother layer of deniability that they want. I mean, independence from the United States is very important politically in their own domestic context. So just finally, I think we know from our own private interactions with different audiences that we're having some kind of impact, some kind of influence. We're being heard, but there's also a sense of needing to maintain some discretion. And then the revolving door is another way. I think that's already been well covered. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Last again, but certainly not least, Rachel.
Thank you. Much of what I was going to say has already been said, so I thought what I would do is pick up on what Dan was raised as, talk a little bit about the evolution. I think one of the most profound shifts that happened in the world of think tanks was actually around 9/11. Around 9/11, and I think we can put it out there as a marker and a date and debate whether that's really when things changed. But what happened at 9/11 is the audience completely changed for who think tanks were engaging and talking to. The public space opened up after 9/11 like I don't think it's ever before, about thinking about foreign policy and making it a public discussion. So before 9/11, I would argue, or I am arguing, is that in the think tank, we were basically talking to each other, and it was very, very focused on national policy. We were talking to policymakers and each other, and writing, I would say, more technically and more within kind of a beltway conversation, right? This was for experts, done by experts, about experts. And a lot of what we thought about was, well, how do we get the public more engaged in the discussion of foreign policy? And that's something that we did think about quite often. How do we kind of get people more engaged? We know there's interest, but how do we do it? After 9/11, that just radically changed, where all of a sudden the public was extremely engaged in foreign policy and was looking to be engaged, and the mission almost changed, right? The mission became, now that there's so much interest, how do we shape it? How do we bring sensible thinkers to that discussion? How do we make sure that people who want to be informed are informed by people that we think are credible? And so we were being looked to, in a sense, by the public to kind of help play that role. I was at the Council on Foreign Relations at the time, and it really played itself out at how do we think about our website. Les Gelb was there, and do we make this a public website? How do we open up this discussion, because there's such a demand, there's such an interest from the public to be engaged. How do we open up these institutions? And what that did right off the bat was opened the market. Suddenly, in think tanks, you had to change how you were writing. You had to write for a more popular media, and that we spent a lot of time thinking about how to do that. And we also brought in different kinds of analysts. The journalists got really pulled into what we were taught because they could help us engage with a broader market. And I think that's also where a lot of corporations got interested, because all of a sudden they began to see thought leaders who were those in think tanks were viewed as thought leaders who were translating between the public and the experts, the practitioners and the public, in a way to help organize thinking, but also that opens up the market. And once you open up your market, you change the funding sources, and it becomes a lot more interesting as well. So I think a lot changed out of that. And I mean, everyone in this room was really part of that, but suddenly, the media changed. So one day you were preparing to go on to the NewsHour, and then the next day it was the Daily Show. Or, I was literally, I was writing for Rolling Stone, as everybody else, here was, and you were testifying before Congress. It was this amazing kind of heady time, but because there was such a demand in a way that there hadn't been before. I remember seeing Ken Pollack on Oprah, and I was like, when did we all end up on Oprah? It was this really kind of change. So everything was kind of changing, and you remember, Dan, right? And so, but I think what that did is the audience was really changing, and so the role changed. But it was also two other things were happening. One is, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, which is, just as all of this changed, there was also a lot of attention being given to the connection between the Bush administration and AEI. And I'm curious about what you all think about why that drew so much attention, because Brookings had contributed mightily to the Carter administration and others. So the connections between a particular think tank and the ideas of an administration wasn't new. But now that the public was suddenly paying so much attention to it, that connection was really elevated and highlighted. And what that meant was others started to see, well, look at the influence that AEI is having on the administration. We've got to make sure that our ideas are also in. So you have very big funders, Saban at Brookings is a perfect example, but others as well, that all of a sudden started coming from very different sources and putting money in think tanks in some ways, I think in very exciting ways, because of this belief that ideas mattered and ideas were being generated in think tanks that were affecting policy in a way that was truly exciting, but it did bring in a lot more resources, and all of a sudden every think tank was building a new building, because all of a sudden they had all this money that they were becoming increasingly and obviously important, and they got new buildings. It was mentioned the financial crisis then, and Jim and I were talking a little bit before this panel, and Michelle mentioned that where all of a sudden all this money was coming in, and then all of a sudden all this money was taken out. So just as all this infrastructure got built up and new people were hired and new buildings were built because of the importance of idea and because of the role that so many different kinds of funders could put into it, all of a sudden it dried up. And I think we're really kind of responding now to this increase of infrastructure and a tightening of sources. And that's in many ways what's causing some of these articles to be written, because we're all beginning to think about, well, how do we maintain this infrastructure, especially when there's not quite as much money from sequester or the financial crisis, or very importantly, foundations. They were the bedrock of the integrity in a lot of ways, because the foundations were giving more populously, if you will. They were giving more across because there were smart people out there doing smart things, and they became very issue focused. So all of this was coming together, and add on social media and all that. Our world has changed so dramatically because our audience is so bigger. The money came rushing in and then tightened very quickly. The channels of communication changed dramatically. all of this in the last decade, and I think it's therefore not surprisingly that it's a very new world. So I wanted to talk about that evolution and maybe prompt a conversation of whether 9/11 is the right place to start. The second point, and I'll end on the second point, is the role of think tanks, I think, very much has always been and continues to be about public education and bringing new ideas into the policy space. And depending on what institution you're at, the balance might be different, but all of them are trying to do some aspect of this. And so I thought it might be useful to talk just for a few minutes about, I'm at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, so what it looks like to not be in the Beltway, and what's the purpose of trying to build a think tank outside of Washington. So on public education, I think it's pretty obvious from where I sit, right, which is in Chicago, we have a role to bring the best thinking of public policy to a Chicago audience. It's a crucial role that we play because there's enormous experience and brain power in the Chicago audience, but often disconnected from the Washington discussion. So to be able to convene and engage the public, I think is actually the former president of the organization, Marshall Bouton, was really driven by this kind of Tocquevillian approach to democracy, which is just because you left Washington didn't mean you disenfranchised yourself from engagement on foreign policy. You needed institutions like ours around the country. But I think in the sense of bringing new ideas, a non-Washington think tank has to be very thoughtful about the issues that they pick, but can play a very significant role in the conversation if picked carefully. So what we've tried to do is figure out issues where in Chicago we might have a value added or something unique to say on national and global perspectives. So the kinds of issues we've chosen are, we were just talking about, it's our survey, which we've been doing for a long time, but global ag and immigration, and we're moving into energy, which is space on global agriculture. Who else can convene the kind of leadership and experience around an issue other than kind of a Midwest organization? Or on immigration, the kind of focus on it's not just about enforcement and keeping the borders strong, it's also about economic competitiveness. So in the Midwest, how do we stop bleeding people to other parts of the country? The only way we can do that is through immigration and trying to explore what that means and bring that to the public discussion as well. And so this notion between public education of both informing this massively larger public that we now are all engaging after 9/11, but also bringing that experience back into the policy world, which has become very professionalized and very kind of DC-centric, I think is an incredibly important role that think tanks can play, and I would argue make it ever more important to selectively build them around the country so it doesn't increasingly narrow into a DC-only conversation around foreign policy. So purpose and evolution, and I'll stop at that.
Thanks a lot. We have about 20 minutes left for questions, and if I was feeling really bossy, I would have enough to ask all of you. But I'm going to be generous, and we'll go to the audience first. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. And you have a mic? Okay. So I will call on you. Steve.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about evolution. Basically, this is directed, I think, to both Rachel and Jim. And it's going to be based on the Brookings Institution, which I spent a year at in the mid-'80s. And if I were to characterize the one difference is that in the 1980s, there were people in the foreign policy studies world at Brookings who could legitimately compete with top 20 academic scholars. In fact, some of them did. Dick Betts goes to Columbia, Bill Quandt goes to Virginia, Yaya Sadowski goes to a number of different places. So they were writing serious books and articles. They were on graduate syllabi. And if I looked at Brookings Foreign Policy Studies today, there's no one. There are adjunct fellows of various kinds, people who are academics who have adjunct appointments there. But of the regular staff, that's not what they do. That's not a criticism. They're doing a different thing. But the composition of the think tank world used to be a lot more like academia, and now it's a lot less. And I don't think it begins with 9/11. I think the process started long before that. But I just love if you would comment a little bit on sort of the changing composition and agenda of the actual people doing the work.
Well, I mean, I think part of in terms of
there is a competitive dimension, and all of this really started, I think, interestingly, I mean, in some respects, with heritage, the advent of heritage, and sort of really shaking up very fundamentally. Some, you know, and I've always pointed out that you really have to look at the strategy and structure of heritage, not necessarily the philosophy. I think many people get caught up in that and don't really understand it. And, you know, and since someone's from AEI here, you know, that was a serious competitive challenge to them. And part of it was around making their products policy relevant. The Washington or Reagan International Airport to Capitol Hill briefcase test really said there has to be a fundamental shift. They were seen initially as a sort of going to be the lightweight that was only going to be here and not have any influence. And they put significant competitive challenge, nearly drove AEI out of business. And a similar thing is happening now in terms of the environment. The positive of all of that, I think, is directly related to what you said and began really in the 80s, is to emphasizing what is your role in the policy process and being more policy oriented and less academic in terms, and it's really now accelerated because of the challenges by technology, etc., that many institutions are considering not publishing books and doing away with journals. So they're becoming even more so. The process is accelerating, and what you're seeing is that I'm not sure that given their unique niche, that that's a bad thing.
Although the irony is that, you know, in some ways this contrast to the narrative you're hearing today. I mean, one of the things you hear when people talk about heritage was the notion that they had this 2,000-page briefing book when the Reagan administration came in, outlining all of these
mandate for leadership.
Right, exactly, and that they wouldn't do that now.
Right, of course. Well, the whole thing, and the interesting dynamic is that heritage is not conservative enough in terms of the Tea Party. And they are now in a squeeze, I would suggest, and DeMint is reflective of that squeeze. The other thing I would just quickly add is that, you know, since I'm a pack rat and have data from 1980s when I started my dissertation, the decline, there has not been a precipitous decline in funding of think tanks. And only ODI and the Institute for Contemporary Studies in San Francisco are the only two in that broad span that went out of business. Every think tank has continued to grow its budget. And, you know, those who beat their chest and say, the liberals who had said that, you know, the corporates are invading and the conservatives are getting all this money, everyone increased their budgets. There is a new set of institutions that captured some funding, but no one suffered in that, is the key point.
Steve, thanks for that. When I was putting together kind of my thinking about what a think tank was and trying to come up with a definition, the first half that I came up with is they offer policy analysts the time and space between academia and the policy world to engage and inform, ... And when I entered into the think tank space, the think tanks were the space between academia and the policy world, with academia having kind of the longer time horizons to ask the bigger and more macro questions, and the policymakers with the tyranny of the inbox, and then the policy schools and the think tanks being somewhere in between, having your questions framed by the policy world, but being able to draw on academia. And I thinking of examples of who did that well, you know, not to suck up to Dan because I'm already on the panel, but I think Dan does that particularly well, and I think that Mark Lynch does that extremely well, and there's few who, you know, are able to do that. You do that very well, who can keep kind of feet in both places. But I think as the time cycle has gotten shorter, with the immediacy of needing to get opinions out, and over time, I mean, Brookings is a perfect example. When a new leader came in and said no more books, that we've been devaluing that kind of ability to bring frameworks and kind of theories to the policy questions that academia kind of, I would argue, gave up on a while back, but think tanks were that middle ground where you could continue to do that, and the ability to do that is either less respected or less able to do that because of the fast cycles. And I wonder if we're in, you know, the pendulum has swung so far that there's seemingly less and less space between the analysts and the practitioners. But I think think tanks at their best really do maintain that time, that space between the two worlds that should be enterable by both sectors. But as I was putting that out about academia and policymakers, obviously there's the journalists and others who are also very important to this. But I think what the academics also used to provide more of the area studies and had been boots on the ground, if you will, or feet on the ground. But as that has been disregarded to some regard, we've pulled in journalists to play that role as people who are there and I was just there, so how do we make sense of it? So I think you bring up a really great point, and I think it's really striking that Brookings was EDU, but that's the space, and I think when people can hold that space, that's when think tanks are really at their best.
So since Brookings has been mentioned a couple of times, maybe I could jump in. I've only been there 6 years, so the trend I've seen fits within the broader trends, I think, that you see in the think tank industry. And time is getting short. Everything needs to be not only blogging size, but tweet size, right? 140 characters. And there's real resistance among the scholars to say, no, that's risky. It's not representing, well, I cannot do that. And others are jumping all on it, and they love it, and they're really engaged in the conversation. And they say they have so much more of an audience than they used to, and having greater impact. So the ground is definitely shifting. In terms of books, that's been really important at Brookings. And in fact, it's varied across the different programs, but in foreign policy, we still have a requirement that you must be constantly working on a book and producing books, and that's why we have Brookings Press, and we have debated, it seems like every other year, should we keep Brookings Press, should we get rid of it? And we continued as a scholarly group saying, no, we really want Brookings Press, it what makes us distinctive, and we value the longer, deeper research that the policy world demands, and then we can also do the shorter things on the side. But even the shorter things are less academic in nature, less the academic journals, and more the Huffington Post or the shorter pieces, and you're definitely seeing that happening across the board.
Heather?
Thanks. Rachel, I loved your suggestion of thinking about 9/11, and what I would suggest is that 9/11's an inflection point where our foreign policy national security universe kind of catches up to and goes from being behind to being at the forefront of trends that are happening more broadly, whether it's the collapse of journalism as we knew it, which I think the reason that journalists flood into the think tank space is that they're pushed out of, it's not just because we're so wonderful, it's because their industry collapsed around them. And another thing where I think I differ a little bit, Jim, with what you said is party discipline has increased dramatically in the last 20 years. So in fact, some of the space some of what's happened in the think tank community is exactly because the space for inter-party management disappeared or was pushed away. So what I'm curious to hear from each of you is if parties are not, if our friends in the domestic side of political science say that polarization is not going away anytime soon, and if the trend toward more data and more evaluation and more assistance on evaluation and metrics isn't going away, so some of the funders need to do this and the funders need to understand, the funders aren't going to. And similarly, if the information environment and the media environment not going to, how do we hold on to the positives about the think tank universe as it is that each of you has pulled out, given that we're being acted on by exogenous factors that we can't fix?
Well, maybe I'll just answer the political one. I mean, what's interesting about the British system of think tanks is they're vastly less partisan than they are here. And perceived as being vastly less partisan. I mean, I remember when I was here, if somebody said, you're a Republican or a Democrat, and I would say, actually, I'm neither. I agree some things on one side and some things on the other side. I mean, I would almost get a sneering response here. You're not brave enough to stand up for one side or the other. It's very, very hard to walk that middle ground, much less so in the UK. There are UK think tanks who label themselves as being, that were started up from conservative or started up from principally conservative or Labour individuals, but there's much more space for a middle space there. It's why I think it is so important for think tanks to manage that middle ground very, very carefully here. I mean, I do think that there is a role in this country, given how partisan Washington has become, to do these kind of initiatives that Michelle talked about, of getting multiple think tanks together from different sides to put forward positions so that you can actually make policy less political. And I think that's a distinction that until you work in the space is often missed. Politics and policy can be extraordinarily disparate. You can't make good policy unless you understand the politics, but policy does not have to be political. And so, I mean, on that particular one, I think there are other ways of doing it. The Europeans, not the Germans, their think tanks are very literally owned by political parties. India, their think tanks are often owned either by political parties or industries. So there are others. But I do think that there are spaces and there are ways that are valued to bridge that. I don't see it happening in this country, unfortunately. So it's for people who work in think tanks over here, I would love to hear what you're all doing about it.
And in terms, I think, and I hope that what comes out of this is some of the key tensions, because what you've pointed to and what Steve pointed to are tensions that are within the think tank community, and the question is, how do you manage them, and who would help support in responding to these very fundamental challenges that think tanks face. So in terms of the next generation, or the movement from more academic to policy-oriented, or the technological challenges, those are things I think how to respond to them and maintain the quality, integrity of the institution is key and needs to be met. The second part is relative, and what I was suggesting is relative to the UK in terms of party discipline, where the legislative and executive are fused, where the politician, in terms of leaders of the party, if they challenge, it has significant implications. And the Obama phenomenon, there's really, anyone in Congress who feels that they are bright enough and have the potential can, upset the apple cart of those who feel that they are destined to be the next president. So, and Hillary is acutely aware of that. Who is the person who's going to be gunning for her? And it wouldn't happen necessarily in the UK, because you are in a safe district and you are returned, and therefore it limits, in some respects, why you need opinions and think tanks to help you support that. And many think tanks or presidential candidates have essentially created, either formally or informally, a think tank to advise them.
In some ways, it's not about partisanship, it's about hierarchy within the parties.
Yeah. No.
That you can argue that even if as parties have become more homogenous, there's less of a, particularly on the GOP side, but also in Democrats, there was always a sense of, it's your time to run or it's not your time to run. That's gone completely out the window now. And I think it's an interesting point that one of the ways in which people can jumpstart their presidential campaigns is to somehow hitch a ride with a think tank in order to support them potentially for the ideas.
And it's also about money.
Yeah.
Because if someone can get enough money, they could run. And that's the same thing.
Let's take two at a time. So the two students back there. We'll start with you and then we can go over. Yeah. Okay. And introduce yourselves, please.
Hi, I'm Molly Zapata. I'm a second-year MALD here at Fletcher. I have a question about think tank coordination and competition, because Xenia mentioned that it's a competitive world of ideas and that you want to work together and collaborate. And it sounds like, from what we've been talking about today, there's so many think tanks in the U.S., over 1,000, 98 of them are foreign policy strategy oriented. And so you have these big ones, you all represent kind of the think tank elite, but then there's all these very small ones that do varying degrees of specialization and focuses. And so it seems like to create good ideas, you would want to work together. But then there's also, my question is, I guess, is there a tension between that and competition for resources? Like, think tanks live by their name and by their reputation, so is it in their best interest to work with others and to work with smaller think tanks?
Thank you. My name is Ben, named Mark Rouse. I'm a PhD candidate here. And I'm curious, our discussion about the consumers of think tank products is focused primarily on the federal government, foreign governments, journalists, the general public. but U.S. governors lead more international trade and investment missions than the president and members of his cabinet. 150 states, municipalities, counties placed sanctions on the apartheid government in South Africa before the federal government did. And regional greenhouse gas initiatives are largely driven by governors. And so I'm curious if you could describe some of the opportunities and challenges that think tanks face influencing state governments, particularly on environmental, economic, and other issues.
Okay, I don't want to run over too much, so that'll be the last questions, and we'll just go down the board.
Well, the reality is that, which we haven't really talked about, is that the, close to 1,800 think tanks in the United States, the vast majority of them are not who's in this room. They're, five.
It was a small room. I couldn't.
Yeah, right.
To be fair,
between the staff is between 5 and 7 people, budget of $1 to $2 million. So that's like 85% of the universe. So that's really, and the other two phenomena related specifically to your question is that there has always been state-based think tanks. And with in terms of within the conservative movement, which people focus on, but it really started long before that in terms of state and local think tanks, and there are a lot of them in every state, and we've documented, and Michelle mentioned in terms of California, we're now looking at policy hubs within the U.S. So there's a clustering. Texas, California, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Illinois have large concentration of state-based think tanks or think tanks within. So it is happening. They do provide, and virtually every week a governor or someone is thinking about at a university where there are a lot of these think tanks are working on those issues. So it's something that happens, and the advice is provided, and it's out there, and there are lists if you are interested.
Let me. It's a great question, but I'd take it one step further. I think that the error that most of us, or one of the other changes that is taking place that the think tank community hasn't quite grasped, is that if you think about kind of foreign relations as opposed to foreign policy strictly defined, foreign relations is done as much by the corporate sector and the NGO sector as it is by the public sector. Who is most effective today on healthcare and education in parts of Africa? It's not their governments, it's not our government, it's actually the Gates Foundation, who's doing tremendous things. The power that the corporate sector has in choosing where they invest a plant or put a pipeline, put serious dollars into the infrastructure in other countries, the power they then have to influence those countries' policy or to set examples or to drive forward the anti-corruption agenda is enormous. And yet think tanks, we tend to still see our audience very much as policymakers. And I think that we really need to rethink that. At the Chatham House, I'm very actively trying to do, and it's quite hard, because I can tell you most corporates sit there and say, wait a sec, we don't want to get involved in policy, because that's kind of political. And what we really don't want to do is get on the wrong side of a political debate in Bangladesh. And so sometimes it's actually kind of hard persuading these people that whether they like it or not, they care deeply that where they're building plants is secure and stable. So they actually care about many of the same interests as the policymakers do, but they define it differently and they use a different language. And so to your point, I actually think that we need to start recognizing yet another new audience. To your question on the tension between working together versus competition, when I worked in, one of my proudest achievements at the NSC is that both the Indians and the Pakistanis kind of liked me and disliked me at equal measure. And so therefore I'd gotten something right. And if you're not in tension, then you're getting something wrong. I think that one of the interesting things, I used to work in the NGO world, and one of the interesting changes that took place in the foundation world probably about 15 years ago is foundations started saying, I don't want to sponsor or support an agency. I want you to partner with another, and I'll sponsor, I'll support an initiative that is 2 or 3 different parties coming together. And so actually, they're changing the incentive structure for us. That was in the NGO world. I think that's also true more recently in the think tank community. There are foundations that will support you if you partner. So a lot of what I do is partnering with American or French think tanks, or frankly, even within the UK, kind of maybe not partnering in quite the same way, but certainly I want my competition at the table, because they actually have some good ideas. If I can take their ideas, even better, and vice versa. So I mean, that tension between competition and collaboration is very present. It needs to be. It's going to be. But I think there are ways of taking advantage of it.
I totally agree with that point, last point about competition and collaboration. And we have a fairly elaborate structure in which we try to identify partners depending on the type of activity. Some are more institutional and involve permission requirement for authorization at the very top, and others proceed more collaboratively at a lower level. But we value it, and we look for it, and we think there's great utility to it for a variety of reasons, including, frankly, sharing resources. I mean, we often share resources with other, oh, I've got a grant on this, you've got a grant on that, there's overlap, let's do this together, and that's been a win-win. On your point about the local governance side, I mean, we have a whole program at Brookings on metropolitan studies that does a lot of this work with governors and mayors, and has been very effective in focusing on metropolitan economies and how to be relevant in the global economy. And it's growing a lot, and it speaks to that reality that the world is changing and globalized at so many different levels. We also try to bring, including in the foreign policy world, scholars out to the field, meaning within the United States, for various talks and visits, and kind of making sure that we're not just stuck in the Beltway doing the Beltway thing, which is dangerous.
Rachel, you get the last word.
Yeah, I was thinking about the local versus state-based initiative. Obviously, so much of the innovation is coming now from the states. We've spent a lot of time thinking about kind of what's our value add in that context. That should be a great opportunity, quite frankly, for us in Chicago. One of the challenges, not surprisingly, is the governors and the mayors, their constituency is domestic. And so when they're thinking about how to expand trade abroad, it's still with an eye towards very, very domestic issues. And so how we kind of help inform that space or be helpful to those thinkers is it's not obvious, but it's a clear change that we're grappling with about, again, who's the audience. And I know with the new leadership, I was talking about our old leadership, but with the new leadership, as Ivo Dalder's come in to run the organization, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how important is Washington to what we're doing. Should we be really thinking about abroad and local rather than DC based, which is space that's well covered by others. And so as we've been grappling with that, a lot of our constituency do want that Washington focus, think we do have a lot to say, but how we broaden is a big part of our agenda because of where we sit and because of how the world is changing. So I think the question is an absolutely important one, and it's yet another one of this laundry list of changes that's happened that's really affecting the space in which we operate.
Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists for getting us off to a great start. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes, but please join me in thanking all of them for doing such great contributions.